In the harsh sun of New Mexico territory, a pregnant woman builds a church with nothing but her bare hands and unwavering faith. Naomi Grace Bell was cast out by her congregation, abandoned by her fiancé, left with only the child growing within. Her in a dream of proving that redemption doesn't require forgiveness from others. Cassian Holt, the territory's wealthiest cattle baron, rides past her construction site daily. His past is stained with violence, his fortune built on questionable deeds, yet something in this woman's quiet determination stirs his hardened soul. He offers help, timber, tools, workers, but she refuses everything except his respectful silence. Day after day he returns, drawn by her steadfast devotion. Through shared labor and evening prayers, two broken souls discover that love can be the most sacred sanctuary of all. But what secret from Cassian's dark past threatens to destroy the only pure thing he's ever found? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scrubland when Naomi Grace Bell first set foot on the abandoned homestead that would become her sanctuary. 6 months pregnant and carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and her father's Bible, she surveyed the barren plot with eyes that had learned to find hope in the most desolate places. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, punctuated only by scattered piñon pines and the distant purple haze of mountains. Here, 15 miles from the town of Socorro, she would build her church, not because God demanded it, but because her soul required the act of creation after so much destruction. Naomi had been the pride of Socorro's First Baptist congregation. Once, Reverend Bell's daughter promised in marriage to Thomas Whitmore, the banker's eldest son, a match that pleased both families and secured her future in respectable society. She could still remember the weight of her mother's pearl necklace against her throat the Sunday Thomas announced their engagement, how the congregation had smiled and nodded their approval. That was before Thomas vanished in the night, taking $3,000 from the church building fund, before the whispered accusations and pointed fingers, before Naomi discovered she was carrying his child and the congregation's charity transformed into cold judgment. A woman of loose morals, Sister Margaret had declared, her voice carrying the authority of 60 years in the church. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I suppose. The irony wasn't lost on Naomi that Sister Margaret spoke these words in the same sanctuary where her father had preached forgiveness and redemption for 23 years. But Reverend Bell had been dead 2 years now, and with him died any protection his daughter might have claimed. The day they asked her to leave, Naomi sat in the front pew where she'd worshipped since childhood, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across her dark hair, as she listened to the elders explain why her presence had become inappropriate for a house of God. She hadn't argued, hadn't pleaded. She'd simply stood, gathered her father's Bible from the pew, and walked out with her head high. The last thing she heard was the heavy oak door closing behind her with a finality that echoed in her chest. Now, standing on this empty land with the desert wind tugging at her simple brown dress, Naomi felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. Here there were no whispers, no judgment, no eyes following her every movement. Here she could build something pure. The abandoned homestead consisted of little more than a crumbling adobe foundation and a well that still drew sweet water. The previous owners had fled during Apache troubles 5 years past, leaving behind only broken dreams and scattered belongings that the desert had slowly reclaimed. Naomi had purchased the land with the last of her savings, 40 acres for $37, a price that reflected both her limited means and the isolation of the property. The deed, signed by a sympathetic clerk in the territorial office, gave her something she'd never truly possessed: independence. She spent her first week clearing the foundation stones, sorting the good from the cracked, planning the dimensions of her church. It would be simple, she decided. A single room with windows facing east to catch the morning light, a bell tower that would ring across the empty miles, calling to anyone who needed sanctuary. The work was backbreaking. Each stone had to be lifted, examined, cleaned, and placed with careful precision. Her hands, once soft from a life of domestic duties, quickly grew calloused. Her back ached constantly, and her expanding belly made every task more difficult. But with each stone she laid, Naomi felt herself rebuilding too, not the compliant preacher's daughter she'd been, but something stronger, more purposeful, someone who didn't require anyone's permission to commune with God. It was during her second week of construction that she first noticed the rider. He appeared on the ridge each morning around 10 o'clock, a dark figure silhouetted against the sky, too distant to make out clearly, but close enough that she could tell he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to commanding respect. He never approached, never called out, simply watched for an hour or so before disappearing. Back over the ridge, Naomi tried to ignore him at first, focusing on her work with deliberate intensity. But his consistent presence began to unnerve her. In her condition, alone and vulnerable, any stranger posed potential danger. On a Thursday morning, as she struggled to maneuver a particularly heavy cornerstone into position, she paused to wipe sweat from her brow and looked directly at the ridge. The rider was there, as always, but something was different. He was closer today, close enough that she could make out the quality of his horse, a magnificent bay stallion that spoke of considerable wealth. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, neither moved. Then the rider touched his hat brim in a gesture that seemed more respectful than threatening, wheeled his horse around, and rode away. That evening, as Naomi prepared her simple supper of beans and cornbread, she found herself wondering about the mysterious horseman. Socorro was cattle country, home to several large ranches, and wealthy cattlemen weren't uncommon. But what would bring one to watch a pregnant woman build a church in the middle of nowhere? She'd heard stories, of course. Tales of men who preyed on vulnerable women, especially those without protection or family. But something in that brief moment of eye contact suggested a different kind of interest. Not predatory, but curious, almost protective. As the days turned to weeks, the rider's visits became as regular as sunrise. Sometimes he'd arrive early, other times later, but he always came. Naomi found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats, though the soft earth rarely betrayed his approach. The church began to take shape, stone by stone, beam by beam. Naomi had ordered lumber from Socorro, paying the extra fee for delivery to her remote location. When the wagon arrived, she was surprised to find timber of much higher quality than she'd requested, seasoned oak and pine that would have cost twice what she'd paid. "Must be some mistake," she told the delivery man, a grizzled Mexican named Carlos who'd been hauling supplies for 20 years. Carlos shrugged, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Man pays, I deliver. You want to argue with good fortune?" "Senora?" She didn't argue, though she wondered who might have arranged for the upgrade. That afternoon, the rider appeared earlier than usual, remaining until the shadows grew long. When he finally departed, Naomi could have sworn she detected satisfaction in his posture. The mystery deepened over the following days as other supplies appeared. A barrel of nails when hers ran low, a set of proper carpenter's tools to replace, her makeshift implements, even a tarpaulin that appeared draped over her lumber pile the morning after a sudden thunderstorm threatened her materials. Each gift was left anonymously, with no note or explanation. But Naomi began to suspect the identity of her benefactor, and the knowledge filled her with a mixture of gratitude and unease. She'd never asked for charity, certainly never expected it from a stranger. One evening, as she sat on her doorstep watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she spoke aloud to the empty desert. "I don't know who you are, but I don't need your pity." The words carried on the wind, and though no one answered, she felt better for having said them. The next morning brought no sign of the rider, and for the first time in weeks, Naomi worked without the sensation of being watched. She told herself she was relieved, but found herself glancing toward the ridge more often than usual. He returned the following day, taking his customary position, but remaining only briefly before riding away. When Naomi checked her supplies that evening, nothing new had been added. The message was clear. The gifts had been offered as assistance, not pity. Her rejection had been heard and respected. For the first time since arriving at the homestead, Naomi smiled as she watched the distant figure disappear over the ridge. Whoever he was, this mysterious benefactor understood something important about her. That respect mattered more than charity, that dignity couldn't be purchased with anonymous kindness. But understanding someone and trusting them were different, matters entirely. As her church continued to rise from the desert floor and her pregnancy advanced toward its inevitable conclusion, Naomi knew that eventually the distance between them would have to close. The question was whether that meeting would bring the sanctuary she was building or the destruction of everything she'd worked to create. The confrontation Naomi had been unconsciously expecting finally came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the desert air carried the first hint of autumn's approach. She was wrestling with a beam intended for the church's roof support, her 7-month belly making the task nearly impossible, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. This time, the rider didn't stop at the ridge. He was coming down the slope directly toward her, and for the first time, Naomi could see him clearly. Cassian Holt sat his magnificent bay stallion with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. Even at a distance, his quality was evident. In the fine cut of his dark coat, the silver conchos decorating his hatband, the polished leather of his boots. But it was his face that caught Naomi's attention, weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, with eyes the color of winter sky that seemed to see everything. He reined in his horse 20 feet away, respectful of her space, but close enough for conversation. "Morning, ma'am." His voice carried the slight drawl of Texas, mellowed by years in New Mexico territory. There was something reassuring in its deep timbre, but Naomi had learned not to trust reassuring men. "Morning," she replied, not moving from her position beside the beam. "You're on private property." "Yes, ma'am, I am." He made no move to dismount or come closer. "I'm Cassian Holt. I own the Bar H Ranch, about 10 miles north of here." The name meant something, even to Naomi. Everyone in Socorro County knew of Cassian Holt, the cattle baron who'd built an empire in less than a decade, whose herds stretched across thousands of acres, whose business dealings had made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. "Miss Bell," she said, then corrected herself. "Mrs. Bell." The lie came easily, a small protection she'd adopted since leaving Socorro. A pregnant woman alone was vulnerable enough without advertising her unmarried status. Cassian touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Bell, I've been watching you work on this building project of yours. Mighty ambitious undertaking for—" He paused delicately. "For a woman in my condition." Naomi's chin lifted. "I suppose it is. I was going to say for anyone. Building a church from the ground up is no small task, even with a full crew." His eyes took in the partially completed structure with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "You're doing fine work." Naomi studied his face for signs of mockery or condescension, but found neither. Still, she remained wary. "What do you want, Mr. Holt?" "To help, if you'll let me." He gestured toward the beam she'd been struggling with. "I've got men who could have this frame up in a week, skilled carpenters, good workers, and I could provide whatever materials you need, proper lumber, hardware, roofing materials." "For what price?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "No price. Call it a donation to the Lord's work." Naomi's laugh held no humor. "Men like you don't give away something for nothing. What do you really want?" Something flickered in Cassian's eyes, hurt perhaps, or recognition of an unpleasant truth. You're right to be suspicious, but in this case, your suspicion is misplaced. I have more money than I know what to do with, and you're doing something worthwhile. Sometimes it's that simple. Nothing is ever that simple. No, he agreed quietly. I suppose it isn't. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through the pinon pines and the distant cry of a hawk. Naomi found herself studying this man who claimed to want nothing but to help her. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of someone who'd done his share of hard work despite his obvious wealth. His horse stood perfectly still, responding to invisible cues that spoke of a deep partnership between rider and mount. I appreciate the offer, Naomi said finally, but I need to do this myself. Why? The simple question caught her off guard. She'd expected argument, persuasion, perhaps even anger. Not genuine curiosity, because she searched for words that would explain what she barely understood herself, because building this church is about more than just putting up walls. It's about proving something. To who? To myself? To God? To everyone who said I couldn't. The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended, revealing depths of anger and determination she usually kept hidden. Cassian nodded slowly. I understand that kind of proving. Something in his tone suggested he truly did understand, and that knowledge unsettled Naomi more than his offer of help had. She didn't want to find common ground with this wealthy stranger, didn't want to feel any connection that might compromise the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve. I should get back to work, she said, turning toward the troublesome beam. At least let me help you with that piece of lumber. It's too heavy for you to manage alone. Before Naomi could protest, Cassian had dismounted and was striding toward her. Up close, she could see he was taller than she'd realized. Probably 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders that filled his coat. But it was his hands, she noticed, as he grasped one end of the beam, scarred hands that had seen violence, though they handled the heavy timber with surprising gentleness. Together, they maneuvered the beam into position, and Naomi had to admit, the task was far easier with his assistance. He worked without speaking, following her lead, letting her direct the placement. Thank you, she said when the beam was secured. You're welcome. He stepped back, dusting off his hands. Mrs. Bell, I know you don't want my help, and I respect that. But would you mind if I continued to ride by occasionally, just to check that you're, well, the request was humble enough that Naomi found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. I suppose that would be all right. Cassian smiled for the first time since their conversation began, and the expression transformed, his serious features entirely. Thank you. That's more kindness than I deserve. He was turning back toward his horse when the sound of approaching riders made them both look toward the main road. 3 men were riding hard in their direction, dust rising in their wake. Even at a distance, Naomi could see they weren't the type of visitors she wanted. Their aggressive posture in the saddle, the way they rode in formation, suggested trouble. Cassian's demeanor changed instantly. The relaxed, almost humble man who'd helped her with the beam disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. His hand moved to rest casually on his hip, near where Naomi now noticed he wore a gun. Friends of yours? He asked, his voice carrying a new edge. No, Naomi said, her mouth suddenly dry. I don't think so. The riders thundered into the homestead yard in a cloud of dust and aggressive energy. Naomi recognized their leader immediately, Frank Morrison, one of Socorro's more unsavory residents, a man who made his living through intimidation and questionable dealings. Well, well, Morrison said, reining in his horse with unnecessary violence. If it isn't the fallen preacher's daughter playing house in the middle of nowhere. His companions, 2 younger men Naomi didn't recognize, spread out slightly, flanking their leader. All 3 were armed, and all 3 wore expressions that suggested they hadn't come for friendly conversation. This is private property, Naomi said, fighting to keep her voice steady. You're not welcome here, Morrison's laugh was ugly. Private property? You mean this patch of dirt you bought with stolen church money? I never stole anything. Maybe not directly. But your fancy fiancé sure did. And word is you knew all about it. Makes you an accessory, doesn't it, boys? The accusation hit Naomi like a physical blow. Even now, months after Thomas's disappearance, the shame and confusion of that betrayal could reduce her to trembling. But before she could respond, Cassian stepped forward. "The lady asked you to leave," he said quietly. Morrison's attention shifted to Cassian for the first time, taking in his expensive clothes and obvious wealth. "Well, now, looks like our little church builder has found herself a patron. You, the one been keeping her in supplies, mister?" "I'm Cassian Holt," was all Cassian said, but the name had an immediate effect. Morrison's cocky expression faltered, replaced by something more cautious. "Mr. Holt," Morrison said, touching his hat brim in grudging respect, "didn't realize you had an interest in this situation." "I have an interest in decent folks being left alone to go about their business." Cassian's voice remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "These folks seem like they have business elsewhere." It wasn't a request, and everyone present understood that. Morrison's eyes flicked between Cassian and Naomi, clearly weighing his options. Taking on a pregnant woman alone was one thing. Confronting the most powerful man in the county was another matter entirely. "Sure thing, Mr. Holt," Morrison said finally. "We were just checking to make sure everything was proper out here. Man hears stories, you know, I'm sure." Cassian stepped closer to Morrison's horse, forcing the animal to sidestep nervously. "But I think those stories might be exaggerated. Maybe it would be better if they stopped circulating entirely." The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but its meaning was unmistakable. Morrison nodded quickly, gathering his reins. "Course, Mr. Holt. No harm meant." He looked at Naomi one last time, his expression promising this wasn't over. "You take care now, Mrs. Bell. Desert can be a dangerous place for a woman alone." The sire. 3 men rode away as aggressively as they'd arrived, leaving Naomi and Cassian standing in settling dust. Naomi's hands were shaking, she realized, and she clasped them together to hide her fear. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Not if they're smart." Cassian's eyes followed the departing riders until they disappeared over a rise. "Morrison's a bully and a coward, but he's not completely stupid. He won't risk crossing me over this. Over what? You barely know me." Cassian turned to face her, and for a moment his careful composure slipped. "I know enough," he said simply. The words hung between them heavy with implication. Naomi found herself looking into those winter sky eyes and seeing depths she hadn't expected, pain, loneliness, and something else that made her breath catch. "Mr. Holt." "Cassian," he said. "I think we're past formalities now." Cassian. His name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for the careful distance she'd been trying to maintain. "I appreciate what you did, but I don't want you to feel obligated. This isn't about obligation." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Those men were a threat to you and your child. That makes it my concern." Why? The question that had been building inside her finally escaped. Why had he been watching her? Why the anonymous gifts? Why step in to protect a woman he didn't know? Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the partially completed church and back again. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Because I know what it's like to build something alone, and I know what it's like to have people try to tear down what you're building." There was a story behind those words, Naomi realized. Pain and loss that matched her own, hidden beneath expensive clothes and carefully controlled expressions. "I should go," Cassian said, stepping back toward his horse. "But I meant what I said about checking on you. Morrison might think twice about bothering you again, but there are other threats in this country. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you can." He swung up into his saddle with fluid grace. "But that doesn't mean you should have to." As he rode away, Naomi stood watching, until he disappeared over the ridge where she'd first seen him. This sea encounter had changed something fundamental between them, she realized. The distance that had protected them both had been breached, and there was no going back to the anonymous safety of their previous arrangement. For the first time since beginning her church, Naomi wondered if she was building more than just a place of worship. Perhaps, without realizing it, she was building a bridge across the loneliness that had defined her life since leaving Socorro. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she turned back to her work, she found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats that might herald his return. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks was both comforting and unsettling to Naomi. Cassian appeared each morning around 9 o'clock, arriving with the punctuality of a man accustomed to keeping schedules. He would dismount at a respectful distance, remove his hat, and ask after her health in that careful, formal way that revealed both breeding and genuine concern. Their conversations began tentatively, focusing on safe topics: the weather, the progress of her construction, the quality of the timber. But gradually, as October painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, their exchanges deepened into something approaching friendship. Naomi found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. After months of solitude, broken only by supply wagons and the occasional unwelcome visitor, Cassian's steady presence became an anchor in her days. He possessed an unusual quality of attention, listening to her words as if they mattered deeply, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. "You're building the windows to face east," he observed one morning, studying her carefully drawn plans. "Particular reason for that?" "Morning light," Naomi replied, adjusting the angle of a window frame. "There's something about dawn that makes a prayer feel more hopeful." "You still pray, then, after everything that's happened?" The question might have seemed intrusive from anyone else, but Cassian asked it with such gentle curiosity that Naomi found herself answering honestly. "More than ever, actually. When people let you down, God becomes more important, not less." "That's a generous way of looking at it." "Is it? I'm not sure generosity has much to do with it. More like necessity." Cassian nodded thoughtfully, his eyes moving to the small wooden cross she'd whittled from scrub oak and mounted above the doorframe. The cross was rough, imperfect, carved with hands that had learned their skill through trial and error, but it caught the morning light with simple dignity. "You made that?" "First thing I carved when I got here. Seemed important to mark this as sacred space from the beginning. It's beautiful work." Naomi glanced at him in surprise. The cross was functional rather than artistic, created by someone who'd never attempted wood carving before. It's crooked, and one arm is thicker than the other. That's what makes it beautiful. It's honest. The word hung between them, honest, carrying implications that made Naomi uncomfortable. She'd built her new life on small deceptions, necessary lies that protected her from judgment and curiosity. The fiction of her marriage, the careful omission of details about Thomas's disappearance, the way she deflected questions about her past. "Honesty is a luxury I can't afford," she said quietly. Maybe that's about to change. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of an approaching wagon interrupted their conversation. Dr. Miguel Martinez, Socorro's physician and one of the few people who'd shown Naomi kindness after her exile, guided his medical wagon into the homestead yard. "Buenos dias, Senora Bell," Dr. Martinez called, setting his brake and climbing down with the careful movements of a man past 60. "I thought it was time for another examination." Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks. Dr. Martinez had been checking on her monthly since her arrival, monitoring both her health and the baby's development. His visits were professional and necessary, but having Cassian present during such a personal matter felt awkward. "Dr. Martinez, this is Cassian Holt," she said, hoping to smooth over the moment. "Ah, Senor Holt." Dr. Martinez smiled broadly, extending a weathered hand. "Your reputation precedes you. I have heard of your generosity to our clinic in Socorro." Cassian shook the doctor's hand with genuine warmth. Dr. Martinez, your work with the poor in Socorro is remarkable. The territory is fortunate to have you. You are too kind. But I think perhaps I should return later. I do not wish to interrupt. No interruption at all, Cassian said quickly. I was just leaving. He turned to Naomi, touching his hat brim. Mrs. Bell, until tomorrow. As Cassian rode away, Dr. Martinez watched him go with shrewd eyes. An interesting friendship, no? He's been helpful, Naomi said carefully. Sigh, I'm sure he has. Cassian Holt is not a man who offers his assistance lightly. Dr. Martinez retrieved his medical bag from the wagon. But come, let us see how you and the little one are progressing. The examination took place in Naomi's small living quarters, a single room she'd partitioned off from the main construction area. Dr. Martinez was thorough but gentle, his practiced hands checking the baby's position and heartbeat while asking detailed questions about her symptoms and overall health. The child is strong, he announced with satisfaction. Perhaps too strong. He kicks like a small mule, no? She, Naomi corrected automatically. I'm convinced it's a girl. Ah, a mother's intuition, usually very reliable. Dr. Martinez helped. Sit up, his expression growing more serious. But I must speak frankly, Senora. This construction work is becoming dangerous for you. Your body is preparing for birth, and heavy labor could trigger early contractions. Naomi's hands moved protectively to her belly. How early? Hard to say. But you are perhaps 6 weeks from your time, and the risk increases each day you continue this work. The news hit Naomi harder than she'd expected. 6 weeks meant the baby would arrive in late November, when winter weather could make travel to Socorro impossible. She'd assumed she had more time to complete the church's basic structure before being forced to slow down. What do you recommend? Dr. Martinez packed his instruments carefully before answering. Rest, light activities only, and arrangements for the birth, either in Socorro, where I can attend you properly, or here with a midwife experienced in difficult deliveries. Here, Naomi said without hesitation. I want the baby born here. In that case, I will speak with Senora Alvarez in Socorro. She is the best midwife in the territory, though convincing her to travel this far will require persuasion. After Dr. Martinez left, Naomi sat on her doorstep, watching the sun set behind the mountains, his words echoing in her mind. 6 weeks. Everything she'd planned, finishing the roof, installing the windows, completing the interior, would have to wait. The church that was supposed to be her proof of independence and faith would remain unfinished, a monument to her physical limitations rather than her spiritual strength. The next morning, Cassian arrived to find her sitting exactly where he'd left her the day before, staring at the incomplete walls with obvious frustration. Dr. Martinez gave you difficult news, he said, dismounting and approaching slowly. He told me to stop working. Naomi's voice was flat, emotionless. Said the baby could come early if I continue with heavy construction. Cassian was quiet for a moment, studying her face. That must be frightening. Not frightening, infuriating. The words burst out of her with surprising vehemence. I've been planning this church for months. Every beam placement, every window angle, every detail designed to be perfect. And now I have to stop before it's finished. The church will still be here after the baby comes, will it? What if I can't manage the work with an infant to care for? What if winter damage requires rebuilding? What if... She stopped, swallowing the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. What if I never get another chance? Cassian sat down beside her on the doorstep, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent that seemed to follow him. Naomi, can I tell you something? The sound of her given name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. In all their conversations, he'd maintained the formal Mrs. Bell, despite her repeated invitations to use her first name. The change felt significant, intimate, in a way that made her suddenly aware of his physical presence. What? 15 years ago, I started building a house for my wife. Biggest, grandest house in the territory. 3 stories, wraparound porches, imported fixtures from back east. I wanted it to be perfect for her, a symbol of how much I loved her. Naomi turned to look at him, surprised by this personal revelation. What happened? She died before it was finished. Cholera epidemic swept through while I was away on business. By the time I got back, he stopped, his jaw tightening with old pain. The house stood empty for years. I couldn't bear to finish. It couldn't bear to tear it down. I'm sorry. The point is, I thought that house was about love, about proving something. But really, it was about my own pride, my need to show the world what kind of man I was. His eyes met hers, winter blue and unexpectedly vulnerable. Your church isn't like that. This isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about creating something sacred, something that will serve God and community long after you're gone. But if it's never finished, it will be finished. Maybe not on your timeline, maybe not exactly as you planned, but it will be finished. You sound very certain. Cassian smiled, and the expression transformed his serious features entirely. I am certain, because I've decided to help you, whether you want my assistance or not. Before Naomi could protest, he continued, Not with money or hired workers, I understand why you refuse those, but with my own hands, my own time, working alongside you until this baby decides to make an appearance, then helping you finish whatever remains afterward. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Naomi found herself speechless. Why would you do that? Because it matters, because you matter. The words were spoken simply, without dramatics, but they carried a weight that made Naomi's breath catch. And because I haven't had anything worth building in a very long time. Looking into his face, Naomi saw something that matched her own. Desperate need for purpose, for redemption through creation. This wasn't charity or pity, it was partnership offered by someone who understood the sacred nature of her work. All right, she said quietly, but we do this together. Equal partners, Cassian agreed, extending his hand. When Naomi shook it, she felt the calluses that spoke of honest work, the strength that promised reliability, the gentleness that suggested he understood her vulnerability. For the first time since leaving Socorro, she didn't feel alone. That afternoon, working side by side to install window frames, they discovered an easy rhythm. Cassian followed her lead, asking questions when he needed guidance, but generally intuiting what needed to be done. His presence transformed the work from solitary struggle into something approaching joy. As the sun set and they prepared to end their first day as partners, Naomi realized that something fundamental had shifted. The church was no longer just her sanctuary. It was becoming theirs, built not just with timber and stone, but with shared purpose and growing trust. The baby kicked hard against her ribs as if approving of the day's developments. 6 weeks suddenly seemed like plenty of time. Their partnership deepened with each passing day, marked by small revelations and growing comfort. Naomi discovered that Cassian possessed an unexpected gentleness with tools and timber. His large, hands capable of delicate work that reminded her of her father's careful attention to detail when preparing his sermons. More surprisingly, she found that his presence didn't feel intrusive, but natural, as if he'd always been meant to share this work. On a crisp morning in late October, as they worked together to raise the final roof beam, Cassian began to speak. About Elena with the hesitant cadence of someone sharing long-held secrets. She was barely 18 when we married, he said, securing his end of the beam while Naomi guided hers into position. Daughter of a merchant in Santa Fe, sheltered, and sweet and completely unprepared for frontier life. Naomi could hear the old pain in his voice, carefully controlled, but still raw after all these years. How did you meet her? Her father had a contract to supply my ranch with goods. I was young then, maybe 25, thinking I knew everything. About building an empire in this territory. Cassian's smile held no humor. Elena came with him on one of his trips, and I took one look at her and decided she was going to be my wife. Decided. Despite herself, Naomi felt a flutter of concern. Did you ask her opinion? Eventually. But I courted her like a campaign. using every advantage I had, money, land, promises of comfort and security. He paused in his work, staring out at the mountains. I wonder sometimes if she ever really had a choice, or if I just overwhelmed her into saying yes. The honesty in his admission surprised Naomi. Most men she'd known spoke of their courtships as romantic conquests, emphasizing their own charm and worthiness. Cassian's willingness to examine his own motivations with such unflinching self-criticism suggested a depth of character she hadn't expected. "She must have loved you," Naomi said carefully. "Women aren't as easily overwhelmed as men like to think." "Maybe. Or maybe she just loved the idea of escaping her father's house." Cassian resumed his work, but his movements had grown mechanical, distant. "Either way, I brought her to a ranch 60 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but cattle and cowboys and endless sky. No society, no culture, no other women to talk with." Naomi could picture it. A young woman accustomed to the social life of Santa Fe, suddenly isolated in the vast emptiness of cattle country. That must have been difficult for her. It was, but she tried to make the best of it. Started a garden, taught some of the ranch hands to read, even convinced me to bring in a piano from Denver. His voice softened with memory. She'd play in the evenings, after supper. Nothing fancy, just simple songs that made the house feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the beam now securely in place. But Naomi sensed that Cassian needed to finish his story, that these memories had been locked away too long. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. Cassian's hands stilled on his tools. "I got word of a business opportunity in Denver, railroad expansion, chance to multiply my holdings if I move fast. Elena was pregnant then, about 6 months along, and I should have stayed with her, but I thought the money would give us everything we needed for the future." Naomi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You were away when she died?" 3 weeks. The cholera hit the ranch 5 days after I left. My foreman sent word, but it took too long to reach me, and by the time I got back—" He stopped, his jaw working with suppressed emotion. "They'd been dead for over a week, Elena and our daughter both." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and guilt that 15 years hadn't diminished. Naomi reached out instinctively, covering his scarred hand with her smaller one. "I'm so sorry, Cassian." The worst part was finding Elena's letters. She'd written to me every day, describing how excited she was about the baby, planning the nursery, talking about the future we'd build together. The last letter, his voice broke slightly. She wrote it the day she took sick, still talking about how much she loved me, how she couldn't wait for me to come home. Naomi felt tears prick her eyes, imagining the young woman dying alone, still believing in the love that had brought her to that isolated ranch. "She knew you loved her too, did she? I've spent 15 years wondering if she died feeling abandoned, thinking I'd chosen business over family." Cassian pulled his hand free and turned to face her fully. "That's why I understand what you're doing here, Naomi. This church isn't just about proving something to the people who cast you out. It's about proving something to yourself. That you can create something lasting, something that won't disappear when life goes wrong." The insight was so accurate, it took Naomi's breath away. In all the months she'd been planning and building, she'd never articulated her motivations so clearly, even to herself. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been trying to do the same thing. Every business deal, every expansion of the ranch, every charitable donation, it's all been about building something that would matter, something that would justify the choices I made." They stood facing each other in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor. For the first time since their partnership began, Naomi felt the full weight of their connection. Not just attraction or friendship, but a deeper recognition of kindred spirits who'd both lost too much and were trying to build their way back to wholeness. "Cassian," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." Before either could say more, The sound of an approaching horse interrupted the moment. They turned to see a rider approaching fast, dust rising in his wake. As he drew closer, Naomi recognized Mateo Guerrero, Cassian's ranch foreman, a weathered man in his 50s whose loyalty to his boss was legendary throughout the territory. "Senor Holt," Mateo called, reining in his horse with obvious urgency. "I need to speak with you." Cassian's demeanor shifted instantly, the vulnerable man who'd shared his grief replaced by the authoritative ranch owner. "What is it, Mateo?" "Private business, Jefe. Perhaps the senora." Mateo glanced at Naomi with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Bell is a friend," Cassian said firmly. "You can speak freely." Mateo's expression suggested he disagreed, but he nodded reluctantly. "Trouble in town, senor. Men asking questions about you, about the old days." Naomi saw Cassian stiffen, his hand moving unconsciously toward his hip, where she now noticed he always wore a gun. "What kind of men?" "Hard men. The kind who make—" "They're living with guns." Mateo's eyes flicked to Naomi again. "They know about your previous reputation." "I see." Cassian's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "How many?" "3 that I saw, but there could be more." Mateo leaned forward in his saddle. "Jefe, maybe it is time to take that vacation you have been talking about, see the sights in California." The suggestion was clearly code for something more serious. Not a vacation, but flight, abandonment of everything Cassian had built in New Mexico. Naomi felt a chill of fear as she began to understand that Cassian's past held dangers she'd never imagined. "No," Cassian said flatly, "I'm not running anymore." "Senor, these are not local troublemakers. These are professionals, men who kill for money." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Professional killers, hunting the man who'd become her partner, her friend, perhaps something more. "Cassian, what is he talking about?" Cassian looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him making a decision that would change everything between them. "There are things about my past I haven't told you, Naomi. Things that might make you think differently about our friendship." "What things?" "Before I became a rancher, before I married Eleanor, I made my living with a gun. I was good at it, too. Good. Good enough that some people still remember, and some of those people hold grudges." The revelation shouldn't have shocked her as much as it did. She'd sensed something dangerous beneath Cassian's civilized exterior, seen the way he carried himself like a man accustomed to violence. But hearing it stated so bluntly, learning that men were actively hunting him, made the threat suddenly real and immediate. "How long ago?" she asked quietly. 15 years, maybe more. After Elena died, I put that life behind me completely. But not everyone has forgotten." "No, not everyone." Mateo cleared his throat impatiently. "Senor, we need to make decisions. Quickly. These men will not wait long before acting." Cassian nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Naomi's face. "Go back to town, Mateo. Keep an eye on them, but don't engage. I'll be along shortly." "And the senora?" "The senora is my concern." After Mateo rode away, Cassian and Naomi stood in silence, the morning's intimacy shattered by the intrusion of his violent past. The church around them, which had seemed like a sanctuary from the world's troubles, suddenly felt fragile and exposed. "You should leave," Naomi said finally. "If staying here puts you in danger, I'm not leaving you alone to face whatever comes." "This isn't your fight, isn't it?" Cassian stepped closer, his winter blue eyes intense with emotion. "Naomi, in the weeks we've been working together, I've felt more alive, more myself, than I have in 15 years. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together. And if those men hurt you because of me, they won't hurt me because of you. If they hurt me, it'll be because of choices I made long before I ever met you." His hand reached up to touch her face gently. "Don't take responsibility for my past, just as I won't judge you for yours." Looking into his eyes, Naomi saw determination that matched her own stubborn faith. This man who'd helped her build not just a church, but a new life, wasn't going to be driven away by threats or fear. "All right," she said quietly. "We finish this together." "Together," Cassian agreed, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her forehead. As he mounted his horse to ride into town and confront whatever dangers awaited him there, Naomi stood in the doorway of her unfinished church and offered up a prayer, not for her own safety, but for the man who'd become far more important to her than she'd ever intended to allow. Cassian returned from Socorro 3 hours later, his face grim and his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Naomi had spent the intervening time trying to focus on interior work, smoothing wall joints, planning the placement of pews, but her attention kept drifting to the main road, watching for his return. "They're still in town," he announced without preamble, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post he'd installed the week before. "Staying at the hotel, asking questions about my business, my routine. What did you learn about them?" "Enough." Cassian removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Naomi had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "The leader calls himself Jake Durango. Ring any bells for you?" Naomi shook her head. But something about the name felt familiar in a way she couldn't place. "He's a killer for hire, been working the territory for years. Usually takes contracts from men with more money than courage, the kind who want problems solved quietly." Cassian's expression darkened. "What troubles me is why he's here now, after all this time. Maybe someone just discovered where you are. Maybe. But my location hasn't been a secret. Any man with enough money to hire Durango could have found me years ago if he'd wanted to." Cassian began pacing, his agitation evident. "The timing bothers me. Why now, when I've finally found—" He stopped mid-sentence, but Naomi understood what he'd been about to say. Why now, when he'd finally found something worth protecting again? "There's something else," Cassian continued. "Durango was asking specific questions about you too, about the church, about how long you've been here, about your situation." A chill ran down Naomi's spine. "Why would he care about me?" "I don't know, but it can't be coincidence." Cassian stopped pacing and faced her directly. "Naomi, I think you should go to Socorro until this is resolved. Stay with Dr. Martinez. He'd welcome you, and you'd be safer in town." "No." The firmness of her refusal surprised them both. "I'm not running from my home because of some hired gun. This isn't about running. It's about being practical. If something happens to me, nothing is going to happen to you." Naomi stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath the fine fabric of his shirt. "We're going to finish this church, and then we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." Cassian covered her hand with his own, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin. "You don't understand what kind of man Durango is, what he's capable of. I understand that you're not the same man you were 15 years ago. And I understand that running away won't solve anything. It'll just move the problem somewhere else." For a moment, they stood close enough that Naomi could see the flecks of gray in Cassian's blue eyes, could smell the sage and leather scent that had become as familiar to her as her own prayers. The attraction that had been building between them for weeks suddenly felt immediate and urgent, complicated by the danger that surrounded them. "Naomi," Cassian said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she whispered, her free hand reaching up to touch his face. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and inevitable, a culmination of weeks of growing trust and affection. Cassian's lips were warm and careful against hers, his hand cradling the back of her head as if she were something precious and fragile. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "We shouldn't," Cassian said, though he made no move to step away. "Why not?" "Because I'm a man with dangerous enemies and a violent past, and you're a woman expecting a child who deserves better than the complications I bring." Naomi studied his face, seeing the self-doubt and guilt that had shaped his life since Elena's death. "What if I'm capable of deciding what I deserve?" Before Cassian could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. This time it was a wagon driven by an elderly Mexican woman Naomi didn't recognize, accompanied by a younger man on horseback. "Senora Bell," the woman called, setting her brake and climbing down with the spry movements of someone accustomed to hard work. I am Carmen Alvarez, the midwife. Dr. Martinez sent word that you would be needing my services soon." Naomi felt a flush of embarrassment. In the drama of the morning, she'd forgotten about Dr. Martinez's promise to arrange for skilled assistance with the birth. Now, having this capable-looking woman appear just moments after her first kiss with Cassian felt awkward and poorly timed. "Señora Alvarez," Naomi said, stepping away from Cassian and trying to compose herself. "Thank you for coming all this way. De nada. The doctor, he pays very well for my time, and besides, I have delivered many babies in difficult circumstances. This will not be so hard, I think." Carmen's shrewd eyes took in Cassian's presence and the obvious intimacy between them. "But perhaps we should examine you first. Make sure all is well with the little one." Cassian cleared his throat. "I should check the perimeter. Make sure we haven't had any unwelcome visitors." As he walked away, Carmen watched him go with obvious approval. A good man, that one. Strong hands, gentle heart. The baby will be lucky to have such a father. "He's not the father," Naomi said quickly. "No. Well, perhaps not by blood. But sometimes the heart chooses better fathers than nature provides." Carmen shouldered her medical bag. "Now, let us see how this little one progresses." The examination took place in Naomi's sleeping quarters, with Carmen proving as thorough and capable as Dr. Martinez had promised. Her experienced hands checked the baby's position and estimated timing with the confidence of someone who'd delivered hundreds of children. "Very soon now," she announced with satisfaction. 2 weeks, perhaps 3 at most. The baby sits low and eager to greet the world. The news was both exciting and terrifying. 2 or 3 weeks meant the birth could happen in early November, when the first winter storms might make travel impossible. "Will you stay?" Naomi asked. "I can pay your usual fee, plus extra for the inconvenience." Carmen's expression softened. "See, I will stay, not for the money, though that is welcome, but because no woman should face childbirth alone, especially not in these circumstances." "What circumstances?" "A woman building a church with her own hands, while men with guns ask questions about her in town?" Carmen shook her head. "You are either very brave or very foolish, mija. Perhaps both." When they emerged from the sleeping quarters, they found Cassian splitting firewood with more force than the task required, clearly working off anxiety and frustration. Carmen watched him for a moment before approaching. "Señor Holt," she said in English, though Naomi suspected her command of the language was better than she typically let on. "You are worried about the men in town." Cassian paused in his work. "You know about them? Word travels fast in small places. Jake Durango, no? I have heard this name before." "Where?" Carmen's expression grew troubled. "Many years ago in Las Cruces, there was a man named Whitmore, a banker who had difficulties with his accounts. Durango was hired to find him when he disappeared." Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. "Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore. Sigh, that was the name. You knew this man? He was my fiancé." Naomi's voice came out as barely a whisper. "He disappeared from Socorro 6 months ago. People said he stole money from the church fund." Carmen and Cassian exchanged a look that made Naomi's stomach clench. "With dread, Señora," Carmen said gently. "The man Durango was hired to find in Las Cruces. He was not brought back alive." The implication hit Naomi like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered. And if Jake Durango had killed him, then his interest in her suddenly made terrible sense. "He knows about the baby," she whispered. "He knows Thomas was the father." Cassian was beside her instantly, his arm around her shoulders as her knees threatened to give way. "We don't know that for certain, don't we?" Naomi looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "A hired killer shows up asking questions about me just months after my fiancé was murdered by another hired killer. That's not coincidence." Carmen nodded grimly. "The baby, it would be proof that Thomas Whitmore lived long enough to—" "How? Do you say, plant a seed? If someone wanted to claim he stole money and then died immediately after, a pregnant woman would complicate that story. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. Thomas's supposed theft, his disappearance, even her exile from the congregation. It had all been orchestrated by someone who needed him dead and discredited. And now that someone had discovered she existed, she and her unborn child had become loose ends that needed to be eliminated. Who would want Thomas dead? Cassian asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Naomi thought back to the weeks before. Thomas's disappearance, trying to remember anything unusual. He'd been worried about something at the bank, said there were irregularities in some accounts, possible embezzlement by someone with access to large sums, someone who could afford to hire killers to clean up the mess, Cassian concluded. But why wait 6 months? If they wanted me dead, why not kill me in Socorro? Carmen's answer was practical and chilling. Because a pregnant woman dying in town would cause questions, investigations. Much easier to let her disappear into the desert, let people assume she died of natural causes, childbirth, accident, wild animals. The casual way the midwife discussed her potential murder made Naomi shiver, but it also strengthened her resolve. Someone had destroyed Thomas's reputation, stolen her place in the community, and now threatened her child's future. She wouldn't let them win. "What do we do?" she asked, looking between Cassian and Carmen. Cassian's expression had hardened into something that reminded Naomi of the dangerous man he'd once been. "We protect what matters, and we find out who's behind this before they can act." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the three of them began making plans for a defense that would require all of Cassian's old skills and Naomi's unwavering faith that justice could still prevail in a world that seemed determined to crush the innocent. The church around them, still unfinished but growing stronger every day, stood as a symbol of their determination to build something beautiful despite the forces arrayed against them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, protected not just by walls and weapons, but by the bonds of trust and affection that had grown between them like flowers blooming in desert soil. The discovery came while Naomi was sorting through a crate of supplies that had arrived the previous week. Hidden beneath layers of packing straw, she found a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth, papers that someone had clearly gone to great lengths to conceal. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the documents, recognizing Thomas's careful handwriting. Immediately, the first page made her heart race. Evidence of embezzlement. H. Morrison, President, First Bank of Socorro. "Cassian," she called, her voice sharp with urgency. He appeared instantly, having spent the morning checking sightlines and defensive positions around the homestead. Carmen, who'd been preparing her birthing supplies, joined them as Naomi spread the papers across her work table. "Bank records," she said, her finger tracing columns of numbers in Thomas's precise script. Thomas wasn't stealing money. He was documenting someone else's theft. Cassian leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm and reassuring as they studied the evidence together. Harold Morrison, Frank Morrison's father, the bank president, yes. Thomas worked directly under him as head clerk. Naomi's voice grew stronger as the implications became clear. "Look at these dates. Withdrawals from church accounts, county funds, even individual depositors, all authorized with Morrison's signature, but the money never reached its intended destinations." Carmen examined one of the documents, her expression grave. "How much money?" "Thousands of dollars, spread over 2 years, enough to ruin the bank if it became public knowledge." Naomi felt a mixture of vindication and grief wash over her. Thomas died trying to expose this, and Morrison killed him too. "Keep it secret," Cassian said, his voice hard with anger. "Then let you take the blame for the missing church funds." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Harold Morrison had been embezzling for years, using his position to systematically loot accounts. When Thomas discovered the theft and began documenting evidence, Morrison had hired Jake Durango to eliminate the threat. Thomas's supposed flight with stolen church money had been the perfect cover story. A young man overcome by temptation, disappearing into the territory with his ill-gotten gains. "But why come after me now?" Naomi asked. "The church money was only a small part of his total theft. Because you're pregnant with Thomas's child," Carmen said quietly. "A child who could inherit claims against the bank, who could grow up asking questions about their father's disappearance." Cassian was studying the papers with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading his enemy's intentions. "There's more to it than that. Look at this. Morrison didn't just steal from depositors. He was funneling money to territorial officials, buying political protection." Naomi followed his pointing finger to a list of names and payments that read like a roster of New Mexico's most powerful men. Judges, sheriffs, even territorial legislators, all receiving regular payments from Morrison's embezzled funds. If this evidence surfaced, it wouldn't just destroy Morrison, she realized. It would bring down half the territorial government. Exactly. And with territorial statehood coming, these men have too much to lose to let that happen. Cassian straightened, his expression grim. They'll stop at nothing to keep this buried. The magnitude of what they faced was overwhelming. Not just one corrupt banker and his hired killer, but an entire network of officials whose careers and fortunes depended on Morrison's secrets staying hidden. "We have to take this to the federal authorities," Naomi said. "The territorial marshal is on Morrison's payroll," Cassian finished, pointing to a name on the list. "Marshal Stevens received $2,000 last year alone." Carmen crossed herself. "Then who can we trust?" "No one in the territory," Cassian said flatly. "But there might be another way." He began pacing again, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "The federal government is already investigating territorial corruption as part of the statehood process. If we could get this evidence to the right people in Washington—" "How? Morrison's people are watching us, and Jake Durango won't wait long before making his move." Cassian stopped pacing and looked directly at Naomi. "There's something else. I haven't told you. Something that might help." Naomi felt a familiar chill. Every revelation about Cassian's past seemed to bring new complications. "What?" "Remember I told you I made my living with a gun before becoming a rancher. What I didn't mention was who some of my clients were." His expression was carefully neutral. "Federal agents working in the territories often needed unofficial assistance with problems the law couldn't touch. You were a government assassin? More like a freelance problem solver, but I still have contacts, people who owe me favors." Cassian's eyes met hers steadily. "I can get word to Washington, but it'll take time we might not have." Before Naomi could respond, the sound of approaching riders made them all freeze. Through the window, she could see 3 men on horseback approaching at a leisurely pace. 2, confident to be friendly visitors, too obvious to be sneaking up for an attack. "Durango," Cassian said, his hand moving to his gun. "Wait." Naomi studied the riders more carefully. "The one in front, that's not Jake Durango. That's Frank Morrison." Harold Morrison's son rode into the homestead yard with the arrogant bearing of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Behind him rode 2 hard-looking men who were obviously hired muscle, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "Mrs. Bell," Frank called out in a mockingly cheerful tone. "Beautiful morning for a visit, don't you think?" Cassian stepped partially in front of Naomi, his body language protective but not overtly threatening. "Morrison, you're a long way from town." "Mr. Holt, I heard you'd taken an interest in our local church project." Frank's smile was all teeth and malice. "How Christian of you to help a woman in distress." "What do you want?" Naomi asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Just wanted to check on your progress. Heard you might be having some difficulties with the construction." Frank's eyes swept over the nearly completed church with obvious displeasure. "Shame if all your hard work came to nothing." The threat was barely veiled. Naomi felt Carmen move closer behind her, the midwife's presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. "The church is coming along fine," Naomi said. "Should be ready for services by Christmas." "Christmas?" Frank laughed, but the sound held no warmth. Mighty optimistic considering. Winter weather can be hard on unfinished buildings, storms, accidents, all sorts of unfortunate incidents. Cassian's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Are you threatening Mrs. Bell, Morrison? Threatening? Goodness, no. Just expressing neighborly concern. Frank's gaze shifted between them with calculating intelligence. Though I have to say, Mr. Holt, some folks in town are wondering about your association with this particular lady, especially given her unfortunate history. What history would that be? Why, her involvement with that thief Thomas Whitmore, of course. Terrible business. A respectable preacher's daughter getting mixed up with a man who'd steal from God's own house. Frank's expression became mockingly sympathetic. Of course, some might say she knew all about his plans. Hard to believe a man would confide in his fiancé about other matters, but keep his criminal activities secret. Naomi felt anger flare in her chest. Thomas wasn't a thief. No. Then where did the church money go? And where's Thomas, for that matter? Frank's tone remained conversational, but his eyes had gone cold. Funny how he disappeared right about the time you discovered you were carrying his bastard. Cassian's hand was on his gun now, his patience clearly exhausted. You've got about 10 seconds to ride out of here before I forget my manners. Easy, Mr. Holt. No need for unpleasantness. I'm just trying to understand why a man of your standing would risk his reputation defending a woman of questionable virtue. The insult hung in the air between them, and Naomi could feel the violence building like pressure before a storm. But before anyone could act, Carmen stepped forward with the fearless authority of a woman who'd faced down death in birthing rooms across the territory. "Senor Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a dignity that made his crude insinuations seem petty and small. "You forget yourself. This woman builds a house of God with her own hands while carrying new life. What have you built with yours?" The simple question hit its mark. Frank's confident sneer faltered slightly as he struggled to respond to the midwife's moral authority. "I've built a respected position in this community," he said finally. "Built on your father's work, no?" Carmen's dark eyes glittered with intelligence. "A man should make his own way in the world, not live off another's labors." Frank's face flushed with anger. "You'd best watch your tongue, old woman. This territory can be dangerous for people who don't know their place. And you'd best remember that God protects those who do his work," Carmen replied calmly. "Even in the wilderness, the standoff stretched taut, balanced on the edge of violence." Finally, Frank gathered his reins with obvious reluctance. "We'll be keeping an eye on things out here," he said, his voice thick with frustrated rage. "Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen to such devoted Christians." As the three men rode away, Naomi felt her knees go weak with relief. Cassian was beside her instantly, his arm around her waist. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "And next time they won't just be making threats." "How long do we have?" "Not long. A day, maybe 2. Cassian's expression was grim. "They're trying to provoke us into doing something stupid or scare us into running. When that doesn't work—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "When intimidation failed, they'd resort to more direct methods." Carmen was already gathering her things. "I must go to town, speak with Dr. Martinez. If there is to be trouble, we will need allies." "It's too dangerous," Naomi protested. "If Morrison's people see you—" "An old midwife visiting the doctor. Nothing suspicious in that." Carmen's smile was fierce. "Besides, there are more people in Socorro who remember your father's kindness than support Morrison's corruption. They just need someone to remind them which side serves God." As Carmen prepared to leave, Naomi felt the weight of the hidden documents in her hands. Thomas's evidence was their only hope of exposing the truth, but it was also what made them targets. The choice before them was simple: destroy the papers and hope Morrison would leave them alone, or use them to fight back and risk everything. Looking at the church around her, the walls they'd raised together, the windows that would soon catch, the morning light, the bell tower that would call the faithful to worship, Naomi knew there was really no choice at all. "We fight," she said quietly. Cassian nodded, his hand covering hers where she held Thomas's final gift. Together. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of winter's first real fury. But inside the sanctuary they'd built with their own hands, three people united by faith and determination, prepared for a battle that would decide whether truth could triumph over corruption, whether love could overcome violence, and whether a woman's faith could move mountains, or at least the men who thought they owned them. The letter arrived with the dawn, tied to the leg of a messenger pigeon that landed exhausted on the church's windowsill. Naomi found it when she emerged to begin her morning prayers. The bird so weary it barely protested when she untied the small, oiled packet from its leg. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the single sheet of paper, recognizing immediately the distinctive handwriting that had once penned love letters and promises of a shared future. But this letter was different, hurried, desperate, written by a man who knew he was running out of time. "My dearest Naomi," it began, and her heart clenched with grief and disbelief. "If you are reading this, then God has granted a miracle and you still live. I pray these words find you safe and that you will forgive the deception that has kept us apart." Cassian appeared at her elbow, drawn by her sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" "It's from Thomas," she whispered, the paper shaking in her hands. "He's alive." The words that followed rewrote everything Naomi thought she knew about. "The past 6 months, I did not steal from the church, my beloved, though I know that is what they told you. I discovered Harold Morrison's theft and gathered evidence, just as you suspected from the documents you now possess. But Morrison learned of my investigation before I could expose him. On the night I disappeared, Jake Durango and his men came. For me, I escaped through the mercy of God and the courage of an unexpected ally, Jake Durango himself. The man you know as a killer is not what he seems. He is a federal agent working undercover to expose the corruption that has infected our territory like a cancer. When Morrison hired him to eliminate me, Jake saw an opportunity to turn the tables. We staged my death, Naomi. Morrison and his conspirators believe I am buried in an unmarked grave outside Las Cruces, taking their secrets to hell with me. But I live, hidden and protected, gathering evidence that will bring down not just Morrison, but the entire network of corruption he serves. I know what my disappearance cost you, your reputation, your place in the community, the shame you must have endured when you discovered you carried our child. The thought of your suffering has been my greatest torment these long months, but I dared not contact you sooner, for fear of exposing you to greater danger. Now that danger has found you anyway. Morrison has learned that you possess evidence of his crimes, and he will stop at nothing to silence you permanently. But take heart, my love. Help is coming. Jake will reveal himself to you soon, and together we will end this nightmare once and for all. Trust no one in Socorro, except Dr. Martinez, who has been secretly assisting our investigation. Trust Jake Durango completely, despite what others may tell you about his reputation. And trust that my love for you has never wavered, that every day of separation has been a day spent fighting to return to your side. Our child will be born free of shame and legitimately named. Our love will be vindicated, and the men who destroyed so many lives for their own greed will face the justice they have so long escaped. Hold fast to your faith, dearest Naomi. God has not abandoned us, though it may have seemed so. He has been preparing the way for our deliverance. Forever yours, in love and determination, Thomas Whitmore, P.S. The man you know as Cassian Holt has been invaluable to our cause, though he may not realize it. His protection of you was no accident. Jake has been watching from afar, ensuring your safety through intermediaries. When the time comes for the final confrontation, you will need Holt's skills as much as his devotion. Trust him as you trust me. Naomi's legs gave way, and she sank onto the church steps, the letter fluttering to the ground. 6 months of grief, shame, and rebuilding her life around Thomas's supposed betrayal, all of it based on a lie. He hadn't abandoned her. He'd been protecting her the only way he could. Cassian retrieved the letter, reading it quickly, while Naomi struggled to process the magnitude of the deception. When he finished, his expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the wheels turning behind his winter blue eyes. "Federal agent," he said quietly. "That explains why Durango was asking questions about both of us. He wasn't hunting me. He was assessing whether I could be trusted to help protect you. But the people he's supposed to have killed, probably. Relocated with new identities, just like Thomas." Cassian sat beside her on the steps, his presence steadying her reeling world. "It's an elegant operation, actually. Use Morrison's own money to hire the killer, then turn the assassin against his employer." Naomi felt tears starting, relief, joy, confusion, and anger, all warring within her. "He let me believe he was dead, let me endure months of shame and exile while he played at being a spy. He was protecting you and the baby. If Morrison thought Thomas was dead, he had no reason to target you immediately." Cassian's voice was gentle, but practical. "The plan worked until someone discovered you had evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy." "Frank Morrison. Probably. Or maybe someone noticed you'd grown close to me and decided that was too dangerous to ignore." Cassian stood, his hand resting on his gun. "Either way, the situation's about to change dramatically." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the desert. But this time, only one man approached, riding slowly, his hands visible and empty of weapons. Jake Durango was smaller than Naomi had imagined, compact and weathered like a piece of desert ironwood. His face bore the lines of a man who'd seen too much violence, but his eyes held an intelligence and weariness that spoke of long years spent walking the line between justice and necessity. "Mrs. Bell," he said, dismounting and removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, "I believe my letter found you well." "Your letter?" Naomi studied his face, seeing now what she'd missed before. The careful way he carried himself, the alertness of a man accustomed to danger but not driven by it. "You're not Thomas." "No, ma'am. But I'm the man who's kept him alive these past months, and the man who's going to reunite you with him." Jake's smile was surprisingly gentle. "Thomas is waiting in a safe house about 30 miles north of here. He wanted to come himself, but we couldn't risk Morrison's people spotting him." Cassian stepped protectively closer to Naomi. "How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know this isn't another deception?" Jake reached into his coat slowly, producing a leather wallet that contained official federal credentials. "Agent Jake Durango, Treasury Department, assigned to investigate territorial corruption. I've been working this case for 2 years, Mr. Holt, and your protection of Mrs. Bell has been invaluable to our success." "My protection was personal, not professional." "I know. That's what made it so effective." Jake's eyes shifted between them, noting the obvious intimacy in their positioning. "Thomas will want to know about that, of course. The situation's grown complicated." Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks as the implications hit her. She'd fallen in love with Cassian while believing herself a widow, but now Thomas was alive and expecting to reclaim the life they'd planned together. The joy of learning about his survival was tempered by the painful realization that her feelings for Cassian couldn't simply be erased. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we finish what Thomas started. Morrison and his conspirators are planning to eliminate you within the next 24 hours. They can't risk letting you live long enough to give birth to a child who might ask inconvenient questions about their father." Jake's expression grew hard. "But they're not expecting us to be ready for them." "What's the plan?" "Simple. We let them come, then we take them all at once. Morrison, his hired killers, and the territorial officials who've been protecting him. It's the only way to ensure they can't escape justice or retaliate later." Cassian frowned. "You're talking about using Naomi as bait. I'm talking about giving her the chance to clear her name and secure her child's future. Thomas has enough evidence to destroy Morrison's entire network, but we need to catch them in the act of attempted murder to make the federal charges stick." The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring Naomi to remain at the homestead while Morrison's killers came for her. But it was also the only way to end the threat permanently and restore Thomas's reputation, and by extension, her own. What about the baby? Carmen had appeared from the church interior, having listened to the entire conversation. She could give birth any day now. The stress of a gunfight could trigger labor, yes, but hiding won't make the danger go away. At least this way, we control the when and where. Jake's expression softened as he looked at Naomi. The choice is yours, ma'am. We can try to get you to safety, but Morrison's people will just follow, and we'll be fighting them on ground of their choosing. Naomi looked around at the church she'd built, the sanctuary that had become the symbol of her independence and faith. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd suffered to create, would be meaningless if she ran now. "We fight here," she said firmly, "in the place I chose to make my stand." Jake nodded approvingly. "Thomas said you'd choose courage over safety. It's one of the reasons he loves you." The mention of Thomas's love should have filled Naomi with joy, but instead it brought confusion and guilt. How could she explain to the man who'd risked everything to protect her that she'd found love with someone else? How could she face Cassian, knowing that their relationship had been built on a foundation of mistaken grief? As if reading her thoughts, Cassian stepped back slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "When this is over, you'll have decisions to make. But for now, let's focus on making sure you live long enough to make them." The practical words couldn't hide the pain in his voice, and Naomi felt her heart breaking for the second time in 6 months. She'd lost Thomas to a deception designed to protect her, and now she was about to lose Cassian to a truth that would restore her former life. But first, they had to survive the night. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the desert landscape, 3 people who'd found family in unlikely circumstances prepared to defend their sanctuary against forces that had already taken too much from all of them. The church bell that Cassian had helped her install caught the morning light, ready to ring out across the emptiness, whether in celebration of victory or as a final call to prayer. Only the coming hours would tell. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Naomi made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. In the small room she'd claimed as her private quarters, she spread out the bolt of white cotton she'd been saving, altar cloth intended for the church's communion table, and began cutting patterns for a dress. "What are you doing?" Carmen asked, finding her with scissors and measuring tape spread across the floor. "Making a wedding dress," Naomi replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil of the day. "If Thomas is alive, if he's really coming back, then we're going to do this properly. No more shame, no more whispers about illegitimate children. This baby will be born to married parents." Carmen knelt beside her, studying the simple but elegant pattern Naomi had sketched. "You are certain this is what you want?" The question hung heavy with unspoken implications. Everyone had seen the way Naomi and Cassian looked at each other, had witnessed the love that had grown between them over months of shared labor and growing trust. To marry Thomas now would be duty rather than desire, obligation rather than joy. "It's what's right," Naomi said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thomas risked everything to protect me and our child. I owe him that loyalty. And Senor Holt, what do you owe him?" Naomi's hands stilled on the fabric. "More than I can ever repay, but that doesn't change the facts of the situation." Carmen's weathered hands covered Naomi's, stilling her nervous cutting. "Mija, sometimes the heart knows truths that the mind refuses to accept. A woman about to face death should marry for love, not obligation. I did love Thomas. I do love him. See, but do you love him as you love Cassian?" The direct question forced Naomi to confront what she'd been trying to avoid all afternoon. Her feelings for Thomas belonged to a different woman, the sheltered preacher's daughter who'd lived her life according to other people's expectations. The woman she'd become through months of solitude, struggle, and partnership with Cassian. was someone else entirely. It doesn't matter what I feel, she said finally. Thomas is the father of my child, and he sacrificed everything to expose the truth. I won't abandon him now. Carmen sighed, but helped gather the cut pieces of fabric. Then we make you the most beautiful wedding dress in the territory. If you must marry from duty, at least you will look like a bride worthy of any man's devotion. As the afternoon wore on, the three women worked together to create something beautiful from simple materials. Carmen's skilled fingers guided the stitching, while Naomi focused on the delicate beadwork around the neckline, tiny seed pearls that caught the light like dewdrops. Even Jake contributed, carving small wooden buttons from pieces of oak left over from the church construction. Cassian maintained a careful distance, spending his time checking weapons and establishing defensive positions around the homestead. But Naomi could feel his presence like a physical weight, could sense his eyes on her whenever he thought she wasn't looking. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake appeared in the doorway of Naomi's quarters. "It's time," he said quietly. "Thomas is here." Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed Jake outside. A single rider was approaching from the north, silhouetted against the dying light. Even at a distance, she recognized the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse with careful precision rather than natural grace. Thomas Whitmore dismounted 20 feet away, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the space that had seemed unbridgeable for so many months. He looked older, thinner, marked by the strain of living in hiding. But his eyes, those gentle brown eyes that had first captured her attention in her father's church, held the same warmth and devotion she remembered. "Naomi," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thomas." They moved toward each other slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the reality of their reunion. When they finally embraced, Naomi felt the familiar comfort of his arms around her, smelled the bay rum cologne he'd always worn. But something was different, not in him, but in her. The desperate relief she'd expected to feel was tempered by a confusion that made her chest ache. "I'm so sorry," Thomas whispered against her hair. "Sorry for what you've endured. Sorry for letting you believe I was dead. If there had been any other way." "I know," Naomi murmured, though she wasn't sure she did know. 6 months ago, she would have forgiven him anything. Now, having built a life from nothing but her own determination and faith, she found herself questioning whether protection was worth the cost of truth. Over Thomas's shoulder, she could see Cassian standing near the church entrance, his expression carefully neutral. Their eyes met for a moment, and she saw in his face the same pain she felt in her own heart, the recognition that duty and desire were often irreconcilable. "You're more beautiful than ever," Thomas said, stepping back to study her face. "Motherhood suits you." His gaze moved to her rounded belly, and his expression softened with wonder. "Our child." "Yes." The word came out more hesitant than she'd intended. Thomas knelt suddenly, placing both hands on her stomach with reverent care. "I've dreamed of this moment for months. Imagined what our son or daughter would look like, what kind of life we'd build together." The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if responding to its father's voice. Thomas laughed with pure joy, and Naomi felt tears start down her cheeks, though whether from happiness or heartbreak she couldn't say. "We should go inside," Jake said, his voice cutting through the emotional reunion. "We have plans to finalize before Morrison makes his move." The interior of the church had been transformed into a command center. Maps of the surrounding terrain covered the communion table, and weapons were stacked against the walls with military precision. Thomas studied the preparations with obvious approval. "You've done excellent work," he told Jake. "Morrison won't expect this level of organization." "That's not my doing," Jake replied, nodding toward Cassian. "Mr. Holt's military experience has been invaluable." Thomas turned to face Cassian properly for the first time, extending his hand with genuine gratitude. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Jake's report said you protected Naomi when she needed it most. Cassian shook the offered hand, his manner polite but distant. Mrs. Bell is a remarkable woman. She needed less protection than you might think. Still, having a man of your reputation standing with her— Thomas paused, studying Cassian's face more carefully. I hope my return doesn't create awkwardness. Jake mentioned that you and Naomi had grown close. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Naomi felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized both men were looking at her, waiting for her to define the nature of her relationship. With Cassian, Mr. Holt has been a good friend, she said carefully. He helped me finish the church when I couldn't manage the work alone. Friend, Thomas repeated, and something in his tone suggested he heard the inadequacy of the word. Of course. Carmen cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should discuss the wedding arrangements. If you plan to marry before the trouble comes— Wedding? Thomas's face lit up with surprised delight. Tonight? If you're willing. Naomi forced herself to smile, though the expression felt unnatural. I made a dress, and Carmen can perform the ceremony. It seems appropriate to be married in the church I built. The church we built, Cassian corrected quietly, then caught himself. That is, the church you designed. I just helped with the construction. The correction highlighted everything that was complicated about the situation. The church was a symbol of Naomi's independence, but it was also a monument to her partnership with Cassian. Marrying Thomas within its walls felt like a betrayal of everything it represented. It's perfect, Thomas said, missing the undercurrents entirely. Getting married here, where you've shown such faith and determination, it feels like a sign from God. As the others discussed logistics, timing, security, arrangements for the ceremony, Naomi found herself studying Thomas with eyes that saw him differently than they had 6 months ago. He was a good man, she realized, honest and devoted, and genuinely worthy of love. But he was also the man she might have married if her life hadn't been shattered and rebuilt into something stronger. The woman who'd agreed to marry Thomas Whitmore had needed his protection and stability. The woman she'd become through months of solitude and partnership with Cassian needed something else entirely, someone who understood that love meant supporting her strength, not sheltering her from her own power. Naomi? Thomas was looking at her with concern. You seem distant. Are you having second thoughts? The direct question demanded an honest answer, and Naomi found herself at a crossroads that would define not just her future, but the kind of woman she chose to be. Not second thoughts, she said slowly, just complicated feelings. So much has changed since you left, I know, but we can rebuild what we had, make it even stronger. Thomas took her hands in his touch gentle and familiar. We can raise our child together, clear our names, start fresh. Isn't that what you want? Looking into his earnest face, Naomi realized that what she wanted and what she should want were two different things. But before she could voice her confusion, the sound of distant gunfire shattered the evening air. They're coming, Jake said, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Sooner than expected, but we're ready. As everyone moved to their predetermined positions, Naomi caught Cassian's arm. After this is over, you'll be Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, he said quietly, as it should be. Cassian, don't. His voice was gentle but firm. We both know what's right here. Thomas is a good man who loves you. Your child deserves to grow up with their father, and you deserve the security and respectability he can give you. What if that's not what I want anymore? Cassian's winter blue eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw in them all the love he was choosing not to express. Then you'll learn to want it, because sometimes what we want and what we need are different things. Before she could respond, another volley of gunfire echoed across the desert, closer this time. The final confrontation was beginning, and whatever choices they made in the next few hours would determine not just who survived, but who they became in the aftermath. Naomi moved to the window that faced east. the same window designed to catch the morning light for prayers. In a few hours, if they survived, that light would shine on her as a married woman, bound by duty and honor to a man she respected, but no longer loved the way a wife should love her husband. The thought should have filled her with resignation. Instead, as she watched Cassian and Thomas work together to defend the sanctuary she'd built, she felt a growing determination to find a way forward that honored everyone she cared about, including herself. The church bell Thomas had mentioned still sat silent in its tower, waiting for the right moment to ring out across the desert. Soon it would call the community to witness either a wedding or a funeral. The only question was, which song of celebration or mourning would echo across the emptiness when the shooting stopped? The attack came with the twilight, when the desert sky had deepened to purple and the first stars were beginning to appear. Naomi stood at the eastern window of her church, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching as muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies. Behind her, the church bell, cast from silver dollars donated by the few townspeople who'd maintained faith in her mission, caught the last rays of sunlight. Carmen had suggested they ring it to call the community to witness whatever transpired tonight, but Naomi had refused. If this sanctuary was to see violence, let it be witnessed only by God and those brave enough to stand within its walls. 6 riders, Cassian reported from his position near the front entrance, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd faced death too many times to fear it. Morrison's leading them himself. They're coming straight up the main approach. No subtlety, no attempt at stealth. Overconfident, Jake observed, checking the load on his rifle. They think they're dealing with one pregnant woman and whatever hired help she could scrape together. Thomas moved to Naomi's side, his own weapon held with the awkward grip of a man more comfortable with ledgers than firearms. "You should be in the back room," he said, his voice tight with worry. "Away from the windows." "No." Naomi's refusal was quiet, but absolute. "This is my church, built with my hands. If someone wants to defile it with violence, they'll do it in front of me." Through the window, she could see the riders more clearly now. Harold Morrison's bulky form, unmistakable even in the fading light. Frank Morrison beside him, with the eager posture of a man anticipating violence. The other 4 were hired gunmen, the kind of men who sold their skills to whoever paid best. "They're stopping," Cassian noted, "about 100 yards out, probably planning to surround us." But as they watched, Harold Morrison urged his horse. Forward alone, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. His voice carried clearly across the desert air when he called out, "Mrs. Bell, I've come to make you an offer." Jake frowned. He's stalling, buying time for his men to get into position. "Maybe," Cassian agreed, "but let's hear what he has to say. Sometimes enemies reveal more than they intend." Naomi moved to the church's front door, her companions flanking her protectively. "I'm listening, Mr. Morrison." "Smart woman. I've always admired intelligence in the fairer sex." Morrison's voice dripped with false joviality. "I have a proposition that might save us all some unpleasantness." "What kind of proposition?" "Simple business arrangement. You have something that belongs to me, and I have something you want." Morrison gestured broadly. "Give me those papers your late fiancé stole, and I'll make sure your child grows up with a father." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. Morrison was claiming to have Thomas, threatening to kill him if she didn't surrender the evidence. But Thomas stood right beside her, alive and whole, which meant, "It's a bluff," Thomas whispered. "He doesn't know I'm here. Or he has someone else," Jake said grimly. "Someone he thinks you care about enough to trade for." Before anyone could speculate further, Morrison continued his macabre auction. "I know you've grown attached to certain friends during your time out here. It would be a shame if something happened to Dr. Martinez, for instance. Such a helpful man, making all those trips to check on your health." Naomi's blood ran cold. Dr. Martinez had been one of the few people to show her kindness after her exile, had risked his reputation by continuing to treat her when other respectable citizens had shunned her. "You're lying," she called out, though fear made her voice shake. "Am I? Miguel, come say hello to the lady." A second rider emerged from the group, and even in the dim light, Naomi could see the unmistakable form of Dr. Martinez slumped in his saddle, his hands bound behind his back. Blood darkened one side of his head, and he swayed as if barely conscious. "Bastards," Carmen hissed, her weathered hands gripping her rifle with surprising steadiness. "They hurt a man who's never harmed anyone in his life." Morrison's laughter echoed across the desert. "The good doctor was very cooperative once we explained the situation to him. Told us all about your condition, your due date, even your arrangements with the midwife. Very thorough medical records." The casual cruelty in his voice made Naomi's hands clench into fists. These men had tortured a defenseless physician to extract information they could use against her. "What do you want?" she demanded. "I told you." "The papers, every document, every record, every scrap of evidence your thieving lover collected." Morrison's voice grew harder. "Bring them out here! Burn them in front of me and the doctor goes free! You have my word as a Christian gentleman." "The word of a man who steals from churches," Cassian observed quietly. "Not worth much." But Naomi was calculating desperately. Dr. Martinez had risked his own safety to help her throughout her pregnancy. Could she let him die to protect evidence against men who'd already cost her so much? "I need time to think," she called out. "Time is something the doctor doesn't have much of. He's lost a fair amount of blood, and head wounds can be tricky things." Morrison's false concern was more chilling than his threats. "I'd say you have about 10 minutes before his condition becomes irreversible." As Morrison rode back to his men, leaving Dr. Martinez swaying dangerously in his saddle, Naomi turned to face the impossible choice before her. "We can't trade the evidence," Jake said firmly. "It's the only thing that can bring down Morrison's entire network. Without it, he'll just kill us all anyway and claim we resisted arrest. And we can't let Dr. Martinez die," Thomas added, his face pale with moral anguish. "He's an innocent man who helped Naomi when no one else would." Cassian was studying the enemy positions through a gap in the wooden walls. "There might be another option. If we can create enough confusion, get close enough to free the doctor." "It's a trap," Jake warned. "Morrison's counting on us trying to rescue Martinez. The moment we leave this building, his men will cut us down." "Then we don't leave the building," Naomi said suddenly, an idea forming in her mind. "At least, not the way they expect." She moved to the communion table, where the church's architectural plans still lay spread beneath the weapons and maps. Her finger traced the lines she'd drawn months ago, showing a feature she'd never mentioned to anyone. "Root cellar," she explained, pointing to a small chamber beneath the church's foundation. "I built it for food storage, but it connects to the old homestead well. There's a tunnel, narrow, but wide enough for one person to crawl through." Cassian studied the drawings with growing interest. "How far does it extend?" "About 50 yards. East. It comes up behind those rocks where we stored the extra timber." Naomi met his eyes, far enough to get behind Morrison's men if they're focused on the church. "I'll go," Thomas volunteered immediately. "It's my fault the doctor's in danger. Those were my documents that started this whole mess." "No," Cassian said flatly. "You're not a fighter, and Naomi needs you here. This is work for someone with experience. And I have the most experience with that tunnel," Naomi added. "I've used it dozens of times to check the well pump. I know every inch of it." The silence that followed her statement was deafening. "Absolutely not," Thomas said, his voice rising with panic. "Naomi, you're 8 months pregnant. You can barely fit through doorways, let alone crawl 50 yards through a tunnel." "He's right," Cassian agreed. "It's too dangerous for you and the baby." But Naomi was already moving toward the hidden entrance, a wooden panel that blended seamlessly with the church's floor. "Dr. Martinez risked his safety for me. I won't abandon him to save my own." Carmen placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Mija, the stress could trigger labor. In a tunnel, with no help. Then we'll deal with that when it happens." Naomi shrugged, off the gentle grip. I'm the only one small enough to move through that space quickly and quietly. And I'm the only one Morrison won't expect to emerge behind his men. Jake was studying the plans with tactical precision. If she can get close enough to free Martinez, create a distraction, we could coordinate an attack from the church at the same time, catch them in a crossfire. It's insane, Thomas protested. Naomi, I'm ordering you as your future husband. You're not my husband yet, Naomi interrupted, her voice carrying a steel that surprised everyone, including herself. And even when you are, you won't give me orders. I've spent 6 months learning to make my own decisions, and I'm not stopping now. The church bell chose that moment to toll once, struck by a gust of desert wind that seemed to carry divine approval. In the sudden silence that followed, Naomi could hear her own heartbeat, strong and steady, despite the danger. 5 minutes, she said, moving toward the tunnel entrance. That's all I need. When you hear the bell ring 3 times, start your attack. As she lowered herself into the narrow space beneath her church, Naomi offered up a prayer, not for her own safety, but for the strength to save a good man and the wisdom to know what kind of woman she wanted to be when this night was over. Behind her, she could hear Thomas calling her name, but she was already crawling into the darkness, following a path she'd built with her own hands toward a confrontation that would test everything she'd learned about faith, courage, and the price of standing up for what was right. The tunnel was darker and more confining than Naomi remembered, her pregnant belly making every movement a careful negotiation with the earthen walls. Roots and stones scraped against her back as she crawled forward, following the path she'd helped dig months ago when establishing the church's foundation. The air was close and dusty, filled with the scent of damp earth and her own fear. Behind her, muffled by dirt and distance, she could hear Morrison's voice growing more impatient. Time's running short, Mrs. Bell. The doctor's looking poorly. Much longer, and he might not survive the trip back to town. Naomi forced herself to move faster, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through her lower back with each forward motion. The baby was restless, pressing against her ribs as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. 20 more yards, she told herself. Just 20 more yards to the exit point behind the timber pile. The tunnel began to slope upward, and she could see a faint square of starlight ahead, the carefully disguised opening she'd created to access the well pump. As she approached it, voices became audible from above. Morrison's men positioned exactly where she'd hoped they would be. Should have just burned them out, one was saying. All this talking is a waste of time. Boss wants those papers intact. Another replied, can't read burned evidence. Hell with the evidence. Dead women don't cause problems. Naomi pressed herself against the tunnel wall, listening to the casual discussion of her murder with a strange detachment. These men spoke of killing her and her unborn child the way other people might discuss slaughtering cattle, necessary work that required no particular emotion. She eased the wooden cover aside, peering through the gap. 2 gunmen stood 15 feet away, their attention focused on the church. Dr. Martinez sat slumped on his horse another 20 feet beyond them, barely conscious, but still breathing. His bonds looked tight, but if she could reach him, a sudden contraction seized Naomi's abdomen, so sharp and unexpected that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The pain radiated from her lower back around to her belly, lasting nearly 30 seconds before gradually subsiding. Not now, she prayed silently. Please, not now. But even as the contraction faded, she could feel the familiar tightening in her lower belly that meant the baby had decided tonight was as good a time as any to make an appearance. Dr. Martinez wasn't the only one running out of time. Moving as quietly as possible, Naomi pulled herself from the tunnel and into the shadow of the timber pile. The night air felt cool against her dirt-streaked face, and she took a moment to orient herself. The 2 gunmen were still talking, their rifles casually held but ready for action. Dr. Martinez's horse stood patient and unguarded. Morrison's men clearly didn't expect a rescue attempt from this direction. Another contraction gripped her, this one stronger than the first. Naomi pressed her face against the rough timber, breathing through the pain, as Carmen had taught her. The contractions were coming too close together for early labor. This baby was serious about being born tonight. She thought about retreating to the tunnel, abandoning the rescue attempt in favor of getting safely back to the church and Carmen's experienced hands. But one look at Dr. Martinez's slumped form reminded her why she was here. This man had shown her kindness when kindness was scarce. She wouldn't abandon him now, moving from shadow to shadow, using the scattered construction materials as cover. Naomi made her way toward the doctor's horse. The animal was well trained, standing quietly despite the tension in the air. She'd almost reached it when another contraction hit, this one accompanied by a warm rush of fluid that soaked through. Her dress, her water had broken. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Fighting through the pain, Naomi reached up to cut Dr. Martinez's bonds with the small knife she'd brought from the church. His eyes fluttered open as she worked, and recognition dawned slowly in his pain-clouded gaze. "Senora Bell," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You should not. Too dangerous." "Hush," she murmured, sawing through the ropes. "Save your strength." The bonds parted just as voices rose from Morrison's position near the church. Someone had noticed the doctor's horse shifting position. "Check on Martinez," Morrison ordered. "Make sure he's still breathing." Heavy footsteps approached, and Naomi knew they'd run out of time for subtlety. She pulled Dr. Martinez from his saddle, his dead weight nearly toppling them both to the ground. A contraction seized her at the worst possible moment, and her gasp of pain echoed across the desert. "What the hell?" The gunman's shout of alarm was cut short as Jake's rifle spoke from the church. The federal agent's shot taking the man in the chest. At the same moment, Cassian emerged from the main entrance, drawing fire from the other scattered gunmen. But Naomi's attention was focused on getting Dr. Martinez to safety behind the timber pile as bullets began flying in earnest. The elderly physician was barely conscious, his legs unable to support his weight, and another contraction was building in her belly with inexorable force. "Can you ride?" she asked urgently. "Sigh, I think so." Dr. Martinez struggled to focus. "But you, the baby, will be born when it's born," Naomi said with more confidence than she felt. "Right now, we need to get you out of here." She helped him onto his horse, then grabbed the reins to lead the animal toward the relative safety of the rocks. But as they moved, she heard Morrison's voice bellowing orders above the gunfire. "Find the woman! She has to be out there somewhere!" Frank Morrison appeared around the edge of the timber pile, his gun drawn and his face twisted with rage. "There you—" "Are you interfering, bitch?" The young Morrison raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a new voice cut through the night. Strong, authoritative, and absolutely furious. "Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and attempted murder of federal witnesses. Jake." Durango stepped into the firelight, his badge gleaming on his chest, and his gun trained on Frank with rock-steady precision. Behind him, Thomas emerged from the church, no longer the mild-mannered bank clerk, but moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd found his courage. "Federal agent," Frank's voice cracked with disbelief. "But you're supposed to be dead? Like Thomas Whitmore? Like all the other people your father hired me to kill?" Jake's smile was cold as winter wind. "Funny how the dead keep turning up alive to testify against you." The gunfight that erupted was brief but decisive. Morrison's hired guns, caught between Jake's position and Cassian's covering fire from the church, found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Harold Morrison himself tried to flee, but Cassian's rifle brought down his horse, leaving the corrupt banker sprawling in the dirt. As the shooting died away, Naomi felt another massive contraction grip her body. This one was different, more urgent, more demanding. She sank to her knees behind the timber pile, one hand gripping Dr. Martinez's stirrup for support. "Doctor," she gasped, I think the baby's coming." "Now." Dr. Martinez, shaking off, his stupor with visible effort, slid from his horse and knelt beside her. His experienced hands moved to her belly, checking the tightness of the contraction. "Sigh," he confirmed, his voice growing stronger as his professional instincts took over. "This baby will not wait for a more convenient time." Through the pain and chaos, Naomi heard the church bell ring 3 times, the signal she'd arranged, though it came far too late to coordinate any attack. Instead, it seemed to announce something else, the imminent arrival of a new soul into a world that had suddenly become safe enough to welcome them. Carmen appeared as if summoned by the bell, her midwife's bag in one hand and a rifle in the other. "The fighting is over," she announced. "Morrison and his men are dead or captured. Now let us see about bringing this baby into the world properly." As gentle hands helped her into the church she'd built with her own determination and faith, Naomi caught sight of Cassian and Thomas standing together near the altar. The 2 men who loved her were no longer rivals, but allies, united in their concern for her welfare and their shared respect for her courage. The church bell continued to ring, its silver voice carrying across the desert to announce that justice had been done, corruption had been exposed, a new life was about to begin in a sanctuary built by a woman who'd refused to let the world break her spirit. And in the east-facing window she'd designed to catch the morning light, the first stars of a new day were already beginning to shine. 3 months later, the sound of the church bell rang across the New Mexico territory with a different purpose than it had on that violent night in November. Now it called the community to witness the dedication of what had become known throughout the region as the Bell Sanctuary, a place where faith had triumphed over corruption, where love had conquered deception, and where a woman's determination had built something lasting from the ruins of her former life. Naomi stood at the pulpit she'd carved from local oak, her infant daughter sleeping peacefully in a cradle nearby. Faith Elena Bell, named for the virtue that had sustained her mother and the woman whose memory had guided Cassian toward redemption, had been born in the early hours of November 15th, delivered by Dr. Martinez and Carmen in the church. Her mother had built with her own hands. The congregation that filled the simple wooden pews represented a transformation as remarkable as any other that had taken place in this desert sanctuary. Families who'd once shunned Naomi now sat in respectful attention, their children playing quietly with toys carved by Cassian's skilled hands. Dr. Martinez occupied a place of honor in the front row, his head wounds healed but his commitment to serving this community stronger than ever. Even Jake Durango had remained in Socorro, trading his undercover work for the more peaceful role of territorial marshal. But it was the man sitting quietly in the back corner who drew Naomi's attention, as she prepared to deliver her first sermon as the sanctuary's ordained minister. Thomas Whitmore looked different now, older, more serious, marked by his months of living in hiding, but also strengthened by the experience. His vindication had been complete. Harold Morrison's confession before his execution had cleared Thomas of all wrongdoing and restored his reputation throughout the territory. Yet the relationship between them had evolved into something neither had expected. The reunion they'd both anticipated had revealed how much each had changed during their months apart. The sheltered bank clerk and preacher's daughter who'd planned a conventional marriage no longer existed. In their place stood 2 people who'd learned to survive on their own strength and discovered they needed different things from love than they'd once believed. "Dearly beloved," Naomi began, her voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "we gather today not just to dedicate this building, but to celebrate the truth that redemption is always possible, that second chances are God's greatest gift, and that love comes in many forms, all of them sacred." Her eyes found Cassian, who sat in the third pew with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. Beside him sat Elena, his wife of 2 months, not the Elena who'd died of cholera 15 years ago, but Naomi herself, who'd taken that name when they married in a quiet ceremony, witnessed only by Thomas, Carmen, Dr. Martinez, and baby Faith. The arrangement had shocked some in the territory, but those who knew the full story understood its wisdom. Thomas had found love with Sarah Martinez, Dr. Martinez's niece, a spirited young woman who shared his passion for books and social justice. Their wedding, planned for spring, would unite two people who'd both learned that sometimes the greatest love stories weren't the ones you planned, but the ones that grew from mutual respect and shared purpose. Marriage, Naomi continued, isn't just about two people promising to love each other. It's about creating a sanctuary where both can become the best versions of themselves. It's about building something together that's stronger than either could construct alone. The parallels to the church itself weren't lost on anyone present. This building had been raised by many hands: Naomi's vision and determination, Cassian's skill and strength, Carmen's wisdom, Thomas's courage, and the community's growing faith in what they could accomplish together. Some of you might wonder about the name we've chosen for this place, Naomi said, gesturing toward the simple wooden sign that hung above the altar. Bell Sanctuary, a place for all God's children. We call it a sanctuary rather than a church, because we believe faith should offer shelter to everyone who seeks it, regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances. As if summoned by her words, the church bell began to ring, not the urgent clanging of crisis, but the steady, measured tolling that called people to worship and celebration. Cassian had installed a rope system that allowed the bell to be rung from inside the sanctuary, and little Faith seemed to enjoy the gentle vibration that traveled through the wooden walls. The bell itself had become legendary throughout the territory. Cast from silver dollars donated by townspeople who'd finally understood what Naomi was building, it bore an inscription that captured the spirit of everything they'd accomplished. Faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. After the service, as the community gathered for the dedication feast that had been spread on tables in the churchyard, Naomi found herself standing with Cassian near the spot where they'd first met. The homestead had grown into a proper ranch house, with additional buildings for the workers who helped manage Cassian's expanded operations. But the church remained the heart of the settlement, its bell tower visible for miles across the desert. "Any regrets?" Cassian asked, his arm around her waist as they watched Thomas and Sarah dancing to music provided by a fiddle player from our town. "About which part? Building the church, marrying you, or letting Thomas find happiness with someone else?" "Any of it. All of it." Naomi considered the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been a disgraced preacher's daughter, pregnant and exiled, with nothing but her faith and stubbornness to sustain her. Now she was a wife, mother, and spiritual leader of a growing community. She'd helped expose corruption that reached to the highest levels of territorial government, had delivered the first sermon ever preached in a church built entirely by a woman's hands, and had found a love deeper and stronger than any she'd imagined possible. "No regrets," she said, finally. "Every choice led to this moment, to this place, to this life. Even the pain was necessary." Cassian squeezed her hand, his wedding ring, forged from the same silver as the church bell, catching the afternoon light. "Thomas seems happy. He is. We both needed to discover who we really were before we could know who we wanted to be with." Naomi smiled as she watched her former fiancé spin Sarah in a joyful circle. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone go so they can find their true happiness. As the celebration continued around them, other couples joined the dancing. Dr. Martinez with Carmen, who'd finally accepted his persistent courtship. Jake Durango with the school teacher who'd recently arrived from Santa Fe. Even some of the younger ranch hands with daughters of local families. But Naomi and Cassian remained where they were, content to hold each other and watch the community they'd helped create flourish in the shadow of the church she'd built, as a monument to faith and perseverance. The sun was setting behind the mountains when the last guests finally departed, leaving only the small family gathered around the church steps, Baby Faith gurgled contentedly in her father's arms, while Naomi and Carmen cleaned up the remnants of the feast. "She'll grow up thinking this is normal," Thomas observed, gesturing toward the church. A woman preaching, people of all backgrounds worshipping together, love that doesn't follow conventional patterns. "Good," Naomi replied firmly. "Maybe her generation will build an even better world than the one we're leaving them." As if in agreement, Faith chose that moment to ring out a laugh that sounded remarkably like the church bell's clear, joyful tone. The sound echoed across the desert, carrying with it the promise of a future where sanctuary could be found not just in buildings made of wood and stone, but in the love and acceptance people offered each other. The church bell tolled once more. As true darkness fell, its silver voice calling across the emptiness to announce that here, in this place built by faith and determination, all who sought redemption would find it. And in the east-facing window that Naomi had designed to catch the morning light, the first stars appeared like distant promises of dawn to come. The cornerstone she and Cassian had laid together bore both their names and a date that marked not just the completion of a building, but the beginning of a love story that would inspire generations. But perhaps more importantly, it marked the triumph of a woman who'd refused to let the world define her worth, who'd built her own sanctuary when others wouldn't provide one, and who'd discovered that sometimes the most sacred spaces are the ones we create through our own courage and faith. In the end, Naomi realized she hadn't just built a church. She'd built a life worthy of the faith that had sustained her through the darkest times, a love that honored both her strength and her gentleness, and a community that proved redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. The bell fell silent, but the sanctuary it protected would ring with laughter, tears, prayers, and love for years to come, a lasting testament to what could be accomplished when someone refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on their dreams.